The Urban Romance of Miracle Doctor. Chapter 1. The story begins at the General Hospital of Oakdale City. The hospital intern, Jacob Ye, took a medical record book and was following Dr. Zhu to check the wards. Suddenly, a panicked voice broke the silence. Dr. Zhu, bad news. The patient in Ward 18 has fainted. A nurse shouted. This patient had a renal cyst and his condition was serious, it had caused blockage in the urethra. He had to undergo surgery now, but there were too many people waiting in line for the operation. It was not yet his turn at all. Dr. Zhu ran towards Ward 18, and Jacob hurriedly followed him. When they arrived at the ward, Dr. Zhu did a quick check of the patient's pupils and hurriedly shouted to Jacob, "Go and tell Chief Dr. Liu to come here immediately." Jacob nodded and rushed to the specialist surgeon's office as fast as he could. When Jacob arrived at the office, he realized that the door of the office was tightly shut. Jacob raised his hand and was about to knock on the door. Through the frosted glass on the door, Jacob witnessed a scene that shocked him. The wife of the patient in Ward 18, a beautiful young woman, was stuffing an envelope into Chief Dr. Liu's hand. She pleaded bitterly, "Please, Chief Dr. Liu, I beg you to save my husband. You know my husband's condition well. His surgery can't be delayed any longer. Can you let him cut the queue for the operation?" Jacob understood that the envelope contained money. Such a thick stack would contain more than 10,000 yuan. Chief Dr. Liu looked embarrassed and said, "It's not that I am not willing to help, but the schedule cannot be rearranged, you'd better take your money back." He seemed to imply that the young woman did not give enough money. The young woman sobbed, "Chief Dr. Liu, I really can't give you any more money than this. I have spent all our savings to treat my husband's illness. Could you please help us?" Chief Dr. Liu slowly stood up and said with a smile, "Don't worry. There will always be a way to solve the problem. I know your family's financial situation. The hospital can give some preferential subsidies to poor families, however, the quota is limited, so it is difficult to apply for it." Chief Dr. Liu's meaning was very clear, and that was that the money offered by the young woman was too little. Jacob could not stand it anymore. He coughed softly and knocked on the door. "Chief Dr. Liu. Who is outside the door?" Chief Dr. Liu was startled. Chief Dr. Liu withdrew the money on the table and stuffed it back into the drawer immediately. He pretended to sit upright. "It's me, Jacob Ye." Jacob pushed open the door and walked in. "What are you doing here? Don't you need to check the wards?" Chief Dr. Liu looked angry. He was not sure if Jacob had seen what had happened just now. "Chief Dr. Liu, the patient in Ward 18 is seriously ill now. He needs to undergo surgery immediately," Jacob said. "I see. You may go and look after him first, I need to have a discussion with the patient's family." Chief Dr. Liu waved his hand impatiently. "Chief Dr. Liu, the patient's condition is very serious. You'd better go and attend to him now. He must have an operation immediately." Jacob deliberately glanced at the drawer that contained the money. His meaning was clear, "I have seen what had happened earlier. You had better treat the patient now." Chief Dr. Liu's face darkened. He was smart enough to understand Jacob's hint. Earlier that morning, Chief Dr. Liu had rushed for another patient's surgery and completed it. He also applied for preferential medical subsidies for the patient, which reduced the patient's medical expenses. Jacob knew that he had completely offended Chief Dr. Liu this time. As he had predicted, Chief Dr. Liu had come to see him as soon as he arrived at work that afternoon. "Jacob, you've been doing a good job here, and you're also good at studying. I really don't have much to teach you here. You can go to the hospital's transfusion center to help for a few days." The transfusion center. Although Jacob Ye was already prepared for Chief Dr. Liu's punishment, he was still shocked by his remark. What's the point of helping at the transfusion center? There are many patients turning up at the hospital these days. The nurses at the transfusion center are busy. You can go help their department for a few days and come back to this department later. As your performance is good, I will leave a good record on your internship report, Chief Dr. Liu said unhurriedly. Chief Dr. Liu's words were encouraging, but the smile on his face was cold. Jacob clenched his fists. Chief Dr. Liu was going to take revenge on him. Jacob was very angry, but he could do nothing about it. It all depended on Chief Dr. Liu's mood, what was to be written on Jacob's internship report. Jacob nodded. Okay, I'll go tomorrow. Kid, this is what happens to you when you try to threaten me. How dare you go against me? I'll be sure to take revenge on you. Chief Dr. Liu said in his heart. Looking at Jacob Ye as he walked away, Chief Dr. Liu smiled darkly. It was already late when Jacob Ye returned from the hospital to the dormitory. Jacob habitually took out a thick ancient scroll handed down from his family and read it carefully. He descended from a family of traditional Chinese medical experts. Since childhood, Jacob Ye had studied Chinese medicine with his grandfather. It was said that this ancient scroll was passed down by an ancestor, and the medical skills recorded in it had no rival.